Hey class, we're starting a new project. You've been working with line and you've been thinking about how design works as an entire discipline with some of our lectures. And I think from our lecture it'd be pretty clear to you that we have elements of design, which are things like line, shape, color, value. Those are like the building blocks. And then we have principles of design, which are organizing things that are sort of more like architectural plans as compared to building blocks. This next project you're going to be working on is going to be using balance, which is a principle, and you're going to be using the element of shape, positive and negative shapes, to show me some ideas about balance. So let's talk about what balance is. It is the equilibrium of opposing or interacting forces in a pictorial composition. Why do I have this picture up with this guy? Because it shows you the feeling of being off balance. And this kind of brings across the idea that balance is a bodily sort of felt sensation. Even if we're seeing it, it's something that we feel in our bodies. It can be kind of compared to our own mental or physical sensibility of when we fall, or why we want to straighten a picture on a wall that's a little bit off, because we want that equilibrium. In visual terms, imbalance can be kind of disturbing. It could produce even vertigo at its worst, or at its best, an imbalance could create tension or attract attention to something. Okay? When it comes to 3D art, like sculpture and then architecture, it's an actual balance, right? As a sculptor, I have to deal with things staying up or sitting on a desk or a wall or a pedestal. If it falls over, that's not good. So that's actual balance that we have to grapple with. And then buildings, of course, really do, because if they fall over, there's a lot of liability for the architect to not kill people, right? But visually, we could think of it as eye weight, the weight of what holds the weight of our eye. Heavy could mean something like a bright color, not something that necessarily weighs a lot, but something that holds a lot of eye attention. So to have balance, we have to have some type of idea of a fulcrum. But before I get into fulcrums, I just want to make clear something that is really important. Asymmetrical balance or imbalances are not something that are necessarily bad in art or design. It just means we have to use them carefully. So I don't want you to take all of what I said here about this slide and the feeling of falling or vertigo to say that you wouldn't ever do it. It's just using them appropriately and knowing when you're using imbalance in design to draw attention to something. So I just want to make that pretty clear before we go any further. Alright, so back to a fulcrum line. What is a fulcrum line? What's a fulcrum point? Well, on a seesaw, it would be that point in which things balance out or tilt to one side or the other, right? So if you can imagine a line running this way, each side of it has to be balanced to be in balance. By balance here, we do not mean physical weight. We're talking about eye weight. So each side has to hold an equal amount of eye weight for it to be in balance on each side of the fulcrum line. So this vertical line for a left to right balance. Okay, so there would have to be equal weight visually on each side. Now you could have a fulcrum line that ran horizontally, and there are types of balances that do top to bottom like that. Usually we think of the bottom to be able to have more weight visually, even on a two-dimensional picture, because of our natural felt sensibility of gravity. We expect the weight to be towards the bottom of a piece because that's how our bodies are grounded on the earth, and we expect things to be grounded. But there are types of balance, and there are ways you could use it to draw your eye up towards the top, and that would give it sort of a different feeling to a piece. Rope walker high above us, it would be a very dynamic sort of weight up there. Too much visual weight at the top, or eye weight, would create a top-heavy composition, and that would make it feel almost like oppressive, or might be even like it was falling over on you in some way. Which, again, not necessarily negative, more like being aware of how you're using something like that. There are places for all breaking the rules, in quotes, so to speak. Okay, so types of balance, and there's different types. We have symmetrical, asymmetrical, radial, and there's also all over or crystallographic balance, where it's like it's also called all over pattern, mosaic balance, and crystallographic balance. This is not exactly that because it's breaking it with the red right, but it creates a grid and a pattern by achieving basically an element that goes all over it, and then you have a weight over the whole design. Okay, so that would be the fourth type. So we have the four types. Let's talk about them and kind of break them down a little bit so we have an idea of what we mean. Symmetrical balance. This is a great example, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. It's basically identical shapes are repeated on either side of a central axis. Could be, like I said, there is a way in which it could be horizontal, but mostly we think of it as a vertical axis. And each element has an exact repetition of it. So that's pure symmetrical balance. It's also sometimes called formal balance. Formal balance because it can be almost very static and formal feeling, and it's that mirroring on the left and the right. Our bodies are actually nearly symmetrical, so we're used to this as in a way, and you could see this by the way Leonardo drew Vitruvian Man. So it's kind of like reassuring type of balance. It's most common in architecture. True formal balance is rare in painting. Sometimes you'll see it, but not as much. This is a great example of it on the Brooklyn Bridge. And the reason why it's common in architecture is because we need things to actually be able to stand up and not fall over. And this type of symmetry balances the actual weight of things. And this picture of the Brooklyn Bridge is using the actual balance of the bridge, capturing it in photography. So it's, as its subject, the bridge actually has actual balance, symmetrical balance, and the photographer took a picture of it to show that. There is, sometimes in certain types of design, you'll see it quite a bit with like a repeating motif or wallpaper on some types of china. You'll see a lot of this type of balance as well. But you can see it here clearly how each side is exactly the same as the other. They're mirrored of each other. There's another type of balance that's symmetry that's called near symmetry. So it's also called approximate symmetry. It's when the design gives the appearance of symmetry, but the actual parts depart a little bit in ways they're not dead on the same. This is a great example. Man Ray was a surrealist artist who uses a lot of photo montage and things back in the darkroom. And he was working with that type of idea here. It's almost the same on each side, but it's not dead on the same, so it's near symmetry. It has a reassuring quality to it, but it's a little bit different to make it interesting, so that would be a kind of version of symmetry, we could say. Let's look at another example of near symmetry. You have this here with the line going right down the middle, right? Let's break this down a little bit, that way it's kind of more clear in case it's not making sense. It probably is, but let's just make sure. You have your line down the middle, okay, and on each side there's something that corresponds to it, right? So far, almost everything, but we have a little difference right here, right, in the way the elephant tusks are. And then over here, up in the sky, there's a little change. This is almost this, but this isn't quite as high as that. There's an extra tree, so it's not quite symmetrical. And then with the girls here at the top, ballerinas, there's 3 here and 2 here. But you get the feeling of balance because these ones have a wider pose, and there's a space here that feels like a third person could be in it. So it's near symmetry, but it's broken up. Things like that tree is a little lower, you know, to make it visually interesting. So it's near symmetry, but not dead-on symmetry, like some of the other pieces we've looked at, where everything is exactly the same on each side, right? So hopefully that makes sense to you, the difference between the two. But near symmetry and symmetry both have a very reassuring quality to them. In asymmetrical balance, we have dissimilar objects that have a balanced visual weight. It's also called informal balance. It can appear very casual and unplanned, but it's actually more complex to pull it off than mirroring something exactly like in symmetrical balance. It can be based on any number of things. This is a sculpture that's an actual object that's balanced, but the asymmetry is happening because we feel a visual weight that's the same across it because of the way his leg is pulling far out and then his body is this way, and there's enough detail in various spots. It's also a sculpture, so we know it actually is standing up, so that's, you know, going in its favor as well. But let's look at some two-dimensional versions of this idea real quick here. Our next piece is a piece you've probably seen a lot of times, one of the most reproduced pieces of art, and you'll know it to be Starry Night by Van Gogh. This is a good example of informal balance because it shows a couple ways in which informal balance can be made. There's different ways you could do it. One of them is by value and color. So this out here, this moon, holds a lot of visual weight because even though it's small and different shaped, this is darker. It has a brightness to it. So value and color can do it. And this one is a regular shaped object and dark and in the foreground, so it holds a lot of visual weight for different reasons. But if you imagine right here, down the middle of this piece, there is a fulcrum line, right about where that church spire is. And you can see that on a seesaw that it's kind of would be imbalanced, like would be where one side was pushing down more than the other. But because this side has a lot of bright values and there's a lot of movement and a little bit higher up at the hill, it ends up feeling balanced even though it's not symmetrical. If that's making sense to you, I hope. If you have questions, feel free to post in the question and answer cafe, and we'll try to dissect kind of what's going on and help you understand it a little bit better. So let's look at some more examples. Hopefully it'll become clearer as we look at things. This would be asymmetrical balance by position. So you can kind of imagine with a rock on a seesaw. It has an unusual, unexpected quality. It can seem casual, but it actually draws the viewer's eye for a closer look. It makes it interesting. This is another way you could do it, to have visual weight that's the same, equal visual weight. A bigger square of gray and a small square of a darker value, right? This kind of shows you some of the ways in which you could pull this off. This is happening through a smaller amount of red and then a bigger amount of cooler colors like green and blue. You could do it by shape as well, because if a larger shape could be balanced by a smaller, more irregular shape. And this is an example of that right here. Francisco Goya, the parasol. So you can see that we're doing this through irregular shapes and basic, more regular shapes. It's creating visual balance. You could also create asymmetrical balance by texture. So you could have something that has a lot of density of pattern and it creates a lot of visual interest. And so it holds the eye. The weight is held, the eye interest is held. And this is an example of that up here. This piece of photo montage, that's an actual piece of a building. The detail and the texture in it holds a lot of weight. And so it ends up balancing the piece out. Another way you could have asymmetrical balance would be by colors. So this is happening here. This color is a little bit brighter. And there's a feeling of balance because they're all within the same tones, but these are more neutral. And then this is a bigger sphere at the top, and these are all kind of the same type of shape. So it creates a balance that way. We're going to go into a new type of balance called Radial Balance, which comes out of coming out of one point and having a feeling of balance. I think that stained glass windows are a really great example of this because they are oftentimes the round ones in Gothic cathedrals do have this exact idea of coming out from a central point and creating a sense of balance across the whole window. It's important to say here, this isn't exactly separate from symmetrical or asymmetrical. This would be radial balance, but it's also symmetrical radial balance because it's all coming out from one point and it's all the same everywhere. You could have a radial balance that would be asymmetrical if it was coming off from a different point. It'd be asymmetrical radial balance, right? But let's not get too deep into the woods on this and just say that radial balance, mostly just to get you understanding it, comes out from a particular point. There's another type of symmetrical balance too that we could talk about called bilateral symmetry. It's exactly like if you drew a line down the middle of something, it would be mirrored perfectly. You could divide it in half, basically, and mirror it. Okay? We talked before about symmetry being, if you have something over here, you have to have something over here, and being the same. The bilateral is that you can divide the thing in half. So it's symmetrical and you could divide it in half. So it's just adding that extra level of it's divided in half on top of being symmetrical. So that's bilateral symmetry. So let's just clarify these last couple ones. A beetle would be bilateral symmetry because you could divide it in half and be the same on both sides. So it's symmetrical and divided in half. The coral polyp would be radial symmetry. It comes out from the middle. And then something like a sponge would have no symmetry. Okay, so there's a few different versions of symmetrical and asymmetrical. Let's talk about the fourth one that we haven't really talked much about. Crystallographic or all over or mosaic balance as different names, but it's all the same thing. This is a perfect example with Jasper Johns. It has no actual fixed point of more interest than the other, and so it has a sort of balance by being an all over, almost like pattern or mosaic everywhere. And you can see this a lot in abstract expressionism. This is Jackson Pollock. And we see it in other types of design work in pop art. This is Jasper Johns. It's kind of a pop art era thing. And then we even get it in other works by Warhol and things like that. What's the point of this? Well, it kind of makes everything the same. It democratizes the entire surface or image to not give anything a particular hierarchy. And so you have to almost look at it as one giant whole in a different way. Even though there's individual elements, it makes the entire thing almost the same feeling. So there's reasons why you would maybe want to use this in design. what type of balance do you think this has? Look at it for a minute with me and see where would we draw the line on this. I think we could draw it somewhere around here. Oops. My drawing skills on the computer are not great. Or we could draw it here. Maybe let's see what the difference. I don't think here because it's not the same with the bridge. So if we look at it, I think we could draw it right here about. Okay? And it's close to being the same on each side. On this side the bushes are in front, there they're behind. There's a little bit more visual weight here with the way the lilies are, but then it holds up over here. These are almost the exact same. And then the back, there's a little bit more weight here in the background to offset that. So I think we could say clearly this would be near symmetry. It's not exactly symmetrical, but it's close to it. And it has a sort of reassuring quality, like a formal quality to it. But the little bit of difference on each side makes it kind of more interesting than a purely symmetrical piece. So for this project we're going to be using shapes as the building blocks of symmetry. Now shapes have different types of qualities to them, just like lines do. There's open shapes, closed shapes, irregular, sometimes called biomorphic shapes like natural, and then there's the more regular or geometric shapes we get. And a lot of paintings are basically shapes of color. Mostly that's what painting really is. You don't get as much line in painting, more like blocks or shape of color. And this, of course, is Picasso's, one of his early famous paintings from Cubism. That was one of the first pieces in that style in modern art. You're going to be using shapes of cut paper, and shapes have a positive shape and negative space. So in this example, Kara Walker, she has interesting work about being a black woman in America, and she uses these negative space shadows and these installations for all of her work. This would be positive shapes, the black, and the negative space is what's left over with the white. So positive shape, any shape or object distinguished from the background, and the negative space is the unoccupied area or empty space surrounding the objects or figures in the composition. This is an example of negative space right here. The gray, it's been made positive by adding gray, and these are the positive shapes. Okay? So when you're designing with this, you're going to be thinking about using the shapes, but when you do use the shapes, you have to think about what space is left behind to make it interesting. Let's look at the design brief or handout assignment sheet. It has some vocabulary on it that kind of just reiterates what we talked about. And at the bottom of it, it shows you an example of what you're going to be doing. You're going to be taking a square piece of black paper and expanding it out to create a symmetrical design and an asymmetrical design. So you need to be careful in the way that you expand it out and not cut into the corners. Right there it says. And I have some certain ways you could think about working if you're not sure what to do. It'll show it on the assignment sheet. Okay? You're going to need black paper for this project, black construction paper. You can use either X-Acto knife or scissors. You're going to need glue, and you'll glue it onto a piece of white paper. Look at some examples here. This is supposed to be a symmetrical one, but the person actually didn't end up doing pure symmetry. They ended up kind of doing near symmetry, and that affected their grade. Because they have it going this way, sort of, being the same, but then it's not exactly the same. And if you try to do it this way, it's not exactly the same that way either. It kind of is, but then these are different, so they got a little confused. But that would be a cool example of something somebody did with a particular sort of motif, repetition of some motifs and a theme. This was their asymmetrical one, using that kind of Halloween type of theme. And you can see how they didn't mess with the corners, but they have a feeling of balance in it. It feels like your visual weight is held throughout the piece, even though it's not the same. It's informal. It's an example of symmetrical balance, except for they left all this black paper. And so they really should have had it coming directly out of there and been the same on each side with the same amount of black paper. So again, someone messed up the idea a little bit, pulling it too far out. But what I like about this is it's got good quality craftsmanship. And this is asymmetrical again. It has the same visual weight throughout it, but it's not the same anywhere. They messed up by pulling something out of the corner. Everything should be looking like this, being expanded out from the paper. Not this, where it doesn't come out. This is not what you want to do. You want it to be like this here, where it comes out of the paper, comes out of the paper, comes out of the paper. You're going to really notice that there's a really high level of craftsmanship in these, and you need to be striving for that type of craftsmanship. I don't want to see projects where it's like you did it in 5 minutes. Basically, sometimes in classes it's easy, if I'm in person with you, to say to you, okay, you need to up your game a little bit and get a fresh piece of paper, practice your ideas a little bit, get out your X-Acto knife, try it again. If you're home working alone and you're not showing me what you're doing in the discussions, I can't really help you do that. But I do want to tell you, you can't just do these type of things in an hour. You're going to need to spend some time planning them out and thinking about them and really coming up with something interesting to make it really actually work very well. I think that a lot of these people get off quite a bit because they're trying to make it too much like an exact picture that they want, rather than focusing on showing the balance and making interesting design. This is an interesting asymmetrical one. Again, they went into the corner and they didn't expand everything, so you're going to have to work through that and really do it correctly. This is interesting, but maybe a little bit too boring, and it's better if you do your symmetrical one by leaving some space in the middle that stays black, and then go out of it the same on each side, and you have a shape in the middle, rather than having a square here that you expand everything out of. They should have done it from, if they had their square, here's their square. Oh, let's see. You have your big square here. Then they should have gone and expanded out each direction from it. Okay? So that would have been the way to do it, instead of just from one side to the other. Asymmetrical, this one's pretty interesting because they actually did it properly. They expanded it out from it, and it's holding a lot of visual interest all the way around it, even though it's not the same everywhere. This is a symmetrical one, but very boring. This got probably a D+ because it took them about 3 minutes. Not literally, but it didn't take them very long to cut out a couple shapes of paper and slap it on something. So this is like A quality work. They could have gone a little cleaner with their geometric shapes, but nonetheless good quality. This is not, it's fine quality, but it's very boring, you know, and it didn't take very much thought. There's not much visual interest, and let's just be honest here, there's a huge amount of area in the middle that's completely untouched and not very interesting, right? So you need to really think about what you're doing there, and not just get stuck waiting till the last moment and then you can't do anything except for this because you waited till the day before to do your project, right? So you got to do some planning ahead and think about what you're going to do. Try out some stuff with some scrap pieces of paper, even a white piece of paper, not the black paper that you spent more money on. and try drawing out some shapes and cutting them and expanding them and see what you can get that's visually interesting. Okay, so just making it very clear to you that you need to have good quality craftsmanship, and it's going to be a lot easier for your symmetrical one if you use a square piece of paper and then more of a rectangular piece of paper for asymmetrical one, but you don't have to. The main thing is you need to use good quality black paper and then cut it out. Some of these elements are working really well here, how they expanded it. They could have, I want to say this as well. See how she expanded this out? Well, she could have taken and done something interesting, which is created a shape like this, for example, and then expanded it out this way. And this would be a solid piece of black paper. And then taken this sheet and expanded it out that way and back and forth a little bit. So it doesn't have to just be expanded out and then it's done. She could have taken and cut out a shape and expanded it back and done the same thing. As long as she did the same thing on each side, then it would be symmetrical. And same here, could have taken this and expanded some back. This broke the rules because this needed to be over there, not up here, to be symmetrical, and it needed to come out of here, so it had to expand outward. So if she would have put this down there, and then that should have been down, this should have been over there, so that it was the same on each side. Okay? But the quality of craftsmanship is really good here. I think the main thing is expanding it back and forth a little bit. What I will say to you that's good about this is how mostly there's not a lot of just empty black paper in the middle. She really went into the space and made it interesting. So that's the kind of work you need to do to get an A. And you got to think through kind of, if you want to have a theme with somewhat visually recognizable imagery, that's totally fine with me, but don't get caught up in so much in that you lose the idea of visual balance. So last project, you guys didn't totally take advantage of posting in the discussion boards earlier and getting more feedback. I'd like to see more people kind of doing some in-progress discussions, not just waiting till the last moment before it's due, but actually posting a little bit in progress so I can see what you got and kind of give you feedback earlier on. Alright, I put a due date on there so that you have to do something by then, because otherwise people never do it. But really, you can use that a lot earlier on in the project to get more feedback and have a bit of discussion with me and each other through that forum. Okay? So I hope you're doing well out there and staying safe, staying out of the smoke and the COVID stuff and everything like that. Okay? Take care, guys.